All right, thank you. Well, I just need to instantly deflate myself from that introduction. Those books you mentioned really are all role models for me, and great models of great journalism, I think. And young writers would all aspire to do something like that. So I really appreciate being here. Thank you. It's a big deal and an honor to get to talk to OCM. The group has really helped educate me as a business reporter over the years as I've learned more about agribusiness. I think OCM is putting forth a lot of views and a lot of facts that you don't see anywhere else. And I think that's really important to get that story out there. And it's also special to me to be here at Colorado College. Actually, my brother David went to this school, and I grew up visiting Colorado College, and then in high school one of my best friends went here, so I came out here a lot. And it's really nice to be back at this campus in this great city. And my brother today actually told me, I don't know if this is true, but he said 30 years ago this fall, the great journalist Hunter S. Thompson talked at this university and kind of became campus legend. I guess he had two conditions to come talk here. He needed to have a sirloin steak dinner provided to him by the university, and he needed an unopened bottle of wild turkey to be behind the podium for his talk. And legend has it that he finished the entire bottle of wild turkey during the talk. What amazes me about that story is that I didn't know writers could put down conditions to go talk somewhere. I thought that if Mike Callicrate called you, you kind of just had to come and get on a plane and come talk, so here I am. But next time I want the wild turkey, that's for sure. So actually, OCM is kind of a hard group to talk to for me as a journalist about this book, The Meat Racket, which has taken up a lot of years for me and a lot of reporting. This is a story that a lot of people in this room have lived. And a lot of what I'm going to say is not going to be necessarily new. I mean, there are a few people in this room that are in the book. So in a way, I feel like I'm kind of telling you something you already know. And I thought a lot about what I wanted to say tonight. And, in the final analysis, I think what can be of use in this story and in this book is to kind of bring everything together into a coherent story, a history, to encapsulate all we know into a narrative, because narratives help us make sense of what's happened in the world. And I think in that way, this can be a useful vehicle for us to understand where we are right now, how we got here, and therefore what we can do to move forward. And I think one of the biggest lessons I learned in reporting this book is that the history that led us here, none of it was inevitable. We're not in the situation we're in today because we were handed down some model from heaven that became the natural way of things through some sort of evolution. We're where we are today because of some very specific actions. And frankly, the thesis of my book is that we've just seen the execution of a pretty brilliant, pretty audacious business plan that's led us here today. So I'd like to talk about that business plan, how it came to be, and how it came to sort of wash its way across middle America. And I give it the nuanced and objective title of The Meat Racket, which is what I think that business plan is. It's the secret takeover of America's food business. So to start, just the headline facts, everybody in this room knows, right? The meat industry today is more consolidated than it ever has been in U.S. history. And I wrote about the meat industry not because it's some crazy outlier or dysfunctional market, but because it really reflects what's happening in our food system. You look across anything, grain processing, genetically engineered seeds, meat, you're going to see the same kind of picture, and it's a picture of tremendous industry consolidation. The cattle market, the national cattle market, is controlled by 4 companies who have an 85% market share. Just as reference, 100 years ago when there was this so-called meat trust of these big bad meat packers like Swift and Armour, you had 5 companies that had 85% of the market. Today we have 4 companies. In the chicken market, it's similar. The top 4 companies have 65% of the market, but it's even more consolidated than that. The top 2 firms have almost half of the market. This slide is a little bit out of date. When I did this, Tyson Foods and Pilgrim's Pride had a combined roughly 45% market share. Today, their market share is down a little bit. If you took, that should probably say the top 3 firms. But still, Pilgrim's Pride and Tyson control roughly 40% of the national chicken market today. You add in Purdue and you get 50%. Just to put that in perspective, In the 1970s, the Department of Justice sued a bunch of companies for antitrust violations, and those companies controlled about half the market. It was 38 firms controlled half the market. Today, 3 firms control that much of the market. In the pork industry, we see that 4 firms control 65% of the market. Okay, so fine. Who cares, right? I mean, we're all good Americans. We love big companies. We're not bothered by success. What's the matter if just a few companies control the entire market? Well, history has shown us that when you have consolidation like this, you have a lot of negative effects and negative consequences. And those consequences are what I'm going to talk about, and we'll just walk through a couple really quickly right now. This is the price of pork, okay? That top red line is what you and I pay for pork at the grocery store. That bottom blue line is what farmers get paid for raising hogs. You can see this clear trend as we've consolidated this business, that the farmers' wages are staying stagnant while the price at the grocery store is skyrocketing. That difference is being kept by companies like Tyson Foods and Smithfield and the retailers like Walmart. Beef prices are seeing a similar thing. It's gradually pulling away. As these companies consolidate in the market, they get something called market power, right? And it gives them the leverage to push down what they pay farmers for their work. It lets them push down what they pay for beef. Let's look at the chicken market. Okay, the chicken market is a black box. It is inscrutable. And the reason why is there is literally no wholesale market for chicken. And this is really where our story starts. The chicken industry is we're going to talk about this, it's vertically integrated. But what that means is a chicken can go from being an egg to a baby chick to a full-grown chicken to a chicken McNugget in a truck. And that animal is never going to touch an open market. It's never going to be bought or sold by anybody. That is total vertical integration. And that is a key concept to understanding where our meat industry is today. So to talk about vertical integration, to talk about consolidation and the industrialization of the meat supply, I decided in my book to look at this company called Tyson Foods. Mr. Calcraft, have you ever heard of Tyson Foods?
I have.
Yeah? See, I'm teaching somebody something here tonight. Tyson is the nation's biggest meat company. They're in beef, chicken, and pork. Everybody thinks my book's about chicken. It's not. They're in all 3 of the major food groups. But I think more important than their size is the fact that Tyson Food pioneered a new model of food production, a new model of meat production, vertically integrated meat production. And they pioneered a model that now dominates the system. So to understand the system, it's really helpful to understand Tyson Foods and to hear the story of Tyson Foods. For me, this story started when I was a business reporter, okay? I was in the Midwest, and I would go around to these chicken farms all the time, just reporting on the food industry. And it's an amazing thing to see a chicken farm, right? You've probably seen them. You have 75,000 birds in a giant chicken house like this. And I just became fascinated with this industry the more I saw it. But to me, this book really started in 2004 when I went to a little town called Waldron, Arkansas. And I met a couple named Jerry and Kenita Yandel. This is one of their chicken houses. So Jerry and Kenita are typical poultry farmers, right? They borrowed several $100,000 to build a facility of several chicken houses like this. And then they signed a contract with a company like Tyson Foods. And Tyson would come deliver the birds to their farm. The contract farmer, like Jerry and Kenita, will then raise the birds for 6 weeks, and Tyson will come back and pick up the animals and take it to the slaughterhouse. I had heard that in this town, Waldron, there was some kind of weird disease that was killing birds, okay? The birds were being delivered, the birds were getting sick, and that was hurting the chicken farmers, because as you can imagine, the farmers get paid by the pound, so when all your birds are dying off, you're getting paid a lot less. Jerry and Kenita had been in business for 25 years. They were born and raised around the chicken industry. They were not strangers to the 7-day work week. They knew how to raise chickens. And in 2004, sort of from the winter of 03 to 04, they were delivered 3 flocks of diseased birds from Tyson Foods. I'm not going to gross you out, but the birds were basically rotting while they were still alive. Nobody knew what was happening. It only took 3 flocks of sick birds to drive Jerry and Kenita out of business. That's how tenuous their financial position was. I could not get my head around that as a reporter, that they owned several $100,000 of assets in these chicken houses and property. They'd been working for 25 years. They were put out of business in about 6 months through no fault of their own. I was stunned by that and started reporting on it more around the town of Waldron and elsewhere. And what I encountered is really what I felt was a modern feudalistic society. You had these chicken farmers like Jerry and Kanita, who, I don't like calling them farmers. I mean, these are small factory owners. These are big operations. They're raising birds on an industrial scale for you and I to eat. These are people that are living flock to flock on the edge of bankruptcy. They can't afford health insurance. They can get driven out of business almost at the whim of a company like Tyson Foods and not push back at all. I mean, these were people that were afraid that their neighbors would find out I was on their property. I did not feel like I was in the United States of America. I mean that, and it's not hyperbolic. So I wanted to discover how in the world could we get here? How could this system operate? Well, this is vertically integrated farming. And first let me show you what vertically integrated farming is not. Okay, this is your traditional rural economy. This is how it used to be. You used to have, in a chicken-producing town like Waldron, you'd have locally owned hatchery that produced the birds. You'd have a farm that raised animals. You'd have a feed mill that provided the feed that was delivered to the farm to feed the birds. You had a slaughterhouse where the birds would be taken, a trucking line, etc. All these independent businesses in this kind of ecosystem of prosperity with each other. In a vertically integrated system, all that industry is sucked into the silo of one corporation's control, okay? A company like Tyson Foods controls the genetics, they control the hatchery, they control the feed mill, the slaughterhouse, the shipping and infrastructure. This is an incredibly well-orchestrated and efficient machine, but it has serious consequences. You can see that they have kept the farm off the balance sheet. They deliver the birds to the farm, but the farmer is more or less independent financially. And again, you can ask, well, heck, what's the problem with this? This sounds really sophisticated, pretty efficient. History shows that when companies get market power like this, when you have one firm that can control every element of production, companies do something funny with their power. They exercise it. Let me give you one small example of how companies like Tyson exercise their power over farmers in a vertically integrated system. I stupidly thought that a chicken farmer would kind of get paid like a corn farmer. They get paid by the pound. They don't. They get paid under this Machiavellian and really ingenious system called the tournament, whereby all these farmers will deliver their chickens to a Tyson Foods plant, and at the end of a given week, Tyson will tally up all the farmers who delivered birds that week. And since Tyson owns all the means of production, Tyson knows exactly how much feed that farmer got, how many birds were there, how much weight the birds gained. And at the end of the week, Tyson will tally all that up in these computers for all the farmers that delivered that week. And then it'll rank each farmer against their neighbor and pay them based on how they ranked against their neighbor. And, you know, the companies say that this incentivizes good performance, right? But one thing you need to understand is that the key metrics for success are the quality of the birds and the chicks that the company delivers to the farm. The farmer has no control over that. In that way, this is much more like a lottery than like a tournament. But this is also a system with a tremendous asymmetry in informational power. What I mean to say is the company's holding all the cards in this tournament, and the farmer's holding virtually none. Okay, this is a horrible slide. I should never show a slide like this because it's hard to see and it makes no sense, but I have to show it. This is an actual tournament tally sheet. This is what the farmer gets at the end of the week to figure out how much money they made. All you need to know is on the left-hand column, this is a real tournament sheet, but I replaced the name of the farmer with my own name. That's the only change here. The left-hand column shows where I ranked in the tournament. You might notice there's some information missing in that ranking. All of it is a white field. I have no idea who else was in that tournament. It is literally my name at spot number 11 and nobody else. Now, what if I wanted to go compare my ranking with my neighbors and find out how they did? You'll notice at the bottom, you probably can't see it from your seat, but it says confidential and proprietary information of Tyson Foods. The ranking of the tournament is confidential and proprietary information. I could be sued for sharing this with my neighbor. Arguably, even sharing this with an attorney could get me sued. So that fact has actually had a chilling effect on chicken farmers sharing information, if you can believe that or not. Because they know that they'll be sued if they share the rankings of the tournament. What you see is that the tournament is a way to divide farmers against one another, to shift volatility from the company to the farmer, and essentially to make sure that farmers never cooperate. This is very important to big chicken companies. And I'd like to point out, finally, that the tournament is a zero-sum game. Tyson pays out a certain amount of money at the end of the week, and the top performers will take their bonus from the bottom performers. So Tyson always knows what it's going to pay at the end of the week. It's the farmers who take on that volatility. The winners take their winnings from the losers. Therefore, this divides rural communities. So how in the world did we get to this place where rural communities are pitted against one another in a kind of dark tournament where they can't even see how their results were tallied? As good a place as any to start this story is back in Springdale, Arkansas in the year 1929, when a really smart young guy named John Tyson came to town. John Tyson grew up on a farm in Kansas. The Depression hit. The farm went out of business. His dad gave him a truck and a bale of hay. John went down south looking for work, and the story has it that he basically ran out of money in Springdale. And he put himself to work. He's one of these like super industrious rural Americans who's going to make a living somehow, some way, however he could. And in his case, he started using his truck to ship chickens. Chicken back then in the 30s was sort of like lobster. It was a specialty meat. It's what you would have for your Sunday dinner. It was expensive, and John could make a lot of money driving chickens up to Chicago, St. Louis, markets like that. And he started making a pretty decent living. And so he started to expand. And in doing so, he started to make all these realizations. He thought, I really more than anything need a steady supply of chickens to get up north. So he started building his own chicken farms. Then he started signing contracts with local chicken farmers to provide him with chickens. Then he built a hatchery and started hatching the birds to give to the farmers who raised them under contract and gave them to him so he could ship them up north. Slowly but surely, almost in an improvised way, John Tyson and other entrepreneurs like himself down in the South started to build the first vertically integrated meat companies, almost on an ad hoc basis. And by 1958, John was being helped by his young son, Don, and they had created one of the first vertically integrated chicken companies in the U.S. They had built their own slaughterhouse in Springdale, Arkansas. That was kind of the final piece of the puzzle. This was a remarkable machine. They could deliver truckloads of ice-packed chickens to grocery stores, and because they had so much control over the farming system, they could choose exactly how many birds to raise, what kind of weight the birds would get. And as they perfected this system, the price of chicken started to fall and fall and fall. The chicken was the first industrial animal. It was the first animal to be raised like a widget in an assembly line. Now, by 1958, Don and John Tyson were just a regional chicken company. There are actually a lot of firms like this, and there's a lot of competition between them. But Tyson became what it is today because of this guy, Don Tyson. Truly, in my opinion, a genius with a capital G. One of the smartest people I've ever talked to in my life. I had the incredible honor of getting to interview him a couple times in his office. And he was an incredibly smart person. He had two qualities that made him a genius, I think. A tactical intelligence and a sort of visionary strategic thinking. I'm going to get into both. But the tactical intelligence came into play with Don's major playbook for growth and prosperity, which was mergers. He was great at mergers. He could value a company in his head, and he somehow always knew exactly the right price to pay for a competitor, because the chicken market was going up and down all the time. And during the down slopes, Don Tyson would buy all the other companies because he was the last man standing. This is what happened to our poultry industry from 1963 to 2007. A wave of mergers. The firms got bigger, then the bigger bought out the bigger. And that's where we saw ourselves getting to the point where we are today with two firms that have the market. It was mostly built, not through some kind of innovation or anything like that, but through mergers and buying out your competitors. But there was, as I said, an element of strategic thinking and visionary thinking that Don Tyson had that was really fundamental to the explosive growth of Tyson Foods and the chicken industry. Don Tyson was present at the creation of one of the greatest technological advances in modern society, the birth of the McNugget. This happened around the 1980s. You know, all these food scientists were figuring out this new stuff to do with chicken because it was getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And Don Tyson saw that chicken was getting so cheap, it was all but inevitable that this was going to become the American meat. And you know, chicken back in the 70s wasn't served at fast food restaurants. It was mostly hamburger, right, and maybe pork. But Don was relentlessly going to McDonald's and Burger King and telling them, you have got to put chicken on the fast food menu. I know it sounds weird, but people are going to be eating chicken sandwiches in a while because I can make a pound of meat cheaper than any pork producer or any cattle producer. Eventually, McDonald's came around. These food scientists at McDonald's invented the McNugget. They said, okay, Don Tyson, can you do this for us? And of course he could, because again, the vertically integrated system he had was perfectly engineered to build something like this. All he had to say was tell me what to make. I can turn around now and reverse engineer the rural economy to produce nothing but your product. I will create birds of exactly the right genetics. I will grow them to the right weight. I will feed them the right thing. I will have a slaughterhouse that does nothing but makes your McNuggets and a trucking line that sends them right to your door. So that he links up with the fast food restaurants. During the 70s, 80s, 90s, chicken becomes the American meat. And as we're about to see, this chickenized model of vertically integrated and industrial meat production became the dominant economic model of livestock production in the United States. This happened, I'm going to peg it to the early 70s. These people at Tyson Foods, they were growing and growing and growing. By the early 80s, Tyson's the biggest poultry company in the world. And there's only so big you can get, right, in a certain market. And these really smart people start looking out to the horizon, wondering, you know, how are we going to grow even further? How can we grow even more? And so they start looking to the hog industry. Something about pigs that really surprised me is how profitable it is to raise pigs. I found out that pigs in rural America are called the mortgage lifter. Well, what that is to say is in Iowa, if you had hogs, you would kind of have them as the cash cow, so to speak, sorry to use that pun, but the cash cow to pay off your debt, to pay off your mortgage. I met Ivy League trained attorneys in Iowa who were put through law school on hog money. So these guys at companies like Tyson Foods and Smithfield very early on see tremendous amount of profit. Back then, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Back then, you know, hog farming looked a lot like this. The animals lived outside, they lived in hutches, they ate grain. It was small scale. There were hundreds of thousands of hog farms in the United States, and collectively, in 1973, they were making nearly $8 billion in pure net income a year. I mean, we're talking a profitable market if you can figure out how to get in there. Tyson did figure out how to get in there. For the book, I interviewed this really interesting guy named Bill Moeller. He had the job in the 1970s of figuring out how to raise pigs the same way they were raising chickens. More or less, here's what they came up with. The modern confined animal feeding operation barn for hogs. This was not easy to do. It took a lot of interrelated breakthroughs and innovations to make this happen. I mean, initially, they were just building big chicken houses and pushing hogs in there and throwing feed in there and trying to raise them. And it was a mess. The animals were getting sick. The animals were fighting. The manure was a terrible problem. In high concentrations, hog manure is toxic. And furthermore, it's very difficult to breed the animals. They're killing the piglets, etc. So you saw a number of innovations come into play. These animals are standing on top of a slatted floor. The manure goes through the floor into lagoons and giant waste pits. They're fed a diet of antibiotics preemptively before the hogs ever get sick. They're fed antibiotics to keep them from getting sick. Not on Joe Maxwell's farm, but on other farms, if I'm correct. That's right. Okay. And, you know, the lagoons, the waste lagoons were another big innovation that they built. One of the most controversial innovations was the so-called farrowing crate or gestation crate. While basic and crude, it's pretty darn smart. You put these mother hogs next to one another, penned in, so they can farrow and have children and then take care of the children without crushing them, without fighting each other territorially. In short, companies like Tyson, companies like Smithfield Foods or Murphy Family Farms cracked the code on how to raise hogs the same way they raise chickens. And when they did that, they had deep pockets, and they had friends on Wall Street, and they built a network of giant hog farms throughout the United States, throughout the Midwest and Southeast. I remember this happening in Missouri in the 90s. All of a sudden, out of the blue, huge operations like this were just sprouting up throughout Missouri and Iowa. Nobody really knew what they were, what this model was all about, and it was kind of bumping up against everybody's communities. I mean, there's a really noxious, horrible smell from these things, I've got to say. And this was the execution of a really brilliant business plan. Here's what happened. They started building this network of hog farms under contract, vertically integrated. A USDA study looking backward showed for every 1% increase in a contract farm, you saw an almost exact 1% decrease in the open market price for hogs. That's amazing to me. What that means is they were building this sort of dark network, and by dark I mean opaque network of contract farms that was sucking the oxygen out of the open market for hogs. And the open market for hogs was like the perfect apogee of capitalism. I mean, it was like a market that was visible. They were traded on futures. I'm sure you've heard about the pork belly future. And it was like a share of IBM. Millions of people back and forth all day long buying and selling hog contracts. And you could see the price go up and down transparently. The contract market, which was opaque, where the price was determined by the terms the farmer could negotiate with Tyson, sucked the oxygen out of that open market, squeezed it aside, until today the open market is just a tiny fraction of the market for hogs. And over about 20 years, we saw 90% of the hog farms in the United States disappear. They were replaced with this. And from a certain point of view, it was fantastic. Smithfield made a ton of money. Tyson Foods made a ton of money. Rural communities did not do so well. Even contract farmers who are in a system like this did not do so well. Because again, you've replaced a transparent market with an opaque market defined by market power. So what was next? Well, of course, it was ranching and cattle. And, you know, interestingly today, this is what cattle ranches still look like. They could never really crack the code economically on raising cows as they did chickens and hogs. There are lots of reasons for that. But suffice it to say, cows need to grow up on grass. And they could never really consolidate this, which is why you have very stubborn and contrarian people that still raise cattle and are independent and are a huge headache for companies like Tyson Foods and JBS. Those are cowboys. Now, what's happened though is at the final stage of a cow's life, they do spend a lot of their time, maybe 3 months or so, on a feedlot, which is kind of close to confinement, but I mean, it's not chicken and hog confinement. It's not pretty, but I mean, animals have a lot of room to walk around. And what we're seeing today is we still have a lot of independent feedlots. I mean, thousands of them that are independently owned. There's still a viable cash market for cattle where you can see that price go up and down every day. There's still an open market to sell on. But the fact is, at the end of the day, we've got thousands of ranchers in the United States, thousands of feedlots. All those cattle are like in a giant funnel, winnowing down to 4 meat packers: National, JBS, Tyson Foods, and Cargill. All those cattle are being slaughtered at a mega complex like this National Beef Plant. I think this is Dodge City, Kansas. I mean, these are small cities, and they are a mechanistic wonder. I mean, countless cows go through there every single day and are processed into boxed beef products. But what this means for the market for cattle is that you've got all these thousands of people out there working hard to raise cattle. And then at the end of the cattle's life, the value of the animal is going to be determined by a bidding war where you've got 4 people bidding on the animal. And that is a totally optimistic scenario. I did a lot of reporting on this, going around to feedlots, etc. I mean, it's an open fact. A feedlot owner it would not be unusual to have 2 bidders on cattle. And we've seen tremendous evidence of what the meat packers are doing is, for example, divvying up markets so they don't compete against each other in a certain area. There's tremendous evidence for that. And so what happens is we've seen a kind of de facto vertical integration at the end of the cattle's life, where more and more feedlots are deciding to just forget the headache of trying to operate in an open market like this where you've got one or two bidders. And what they're doing is signing contracts with companies like Tyson Foods or national, sort of, not production contracts, but sales contracts. And so it's like lights getting snuffed out and going dark. More and more cattle leaving the open market. We've seen this story before. Eventually, I predict, sadly, the open market for cattle is going to disappear in this country. Virtually everyone will be producing animals under contract, and it'll look a lot like chicken and hog production. So what? I mean, what we have now is a scenario, Diana Moss was talking about this today, it's shaped like an hourglass. Our entire meat system is shaped like an hourglass. On the left side, you've got thousands of people in rural America trying to make a living raising animals, chickens, hogs, and cattle. And you know what? That's really important. It's a really important part of rural economies. Raising meat is still a pillar of rural economies. It's not a hobby. On the other side, you've got us, everybody who eats meat. I mean, that's 95% of Americans. That's a lot of people. In the middle, you've got 4 companies, depending how you slice it, maybe 6 at most, because it's a little bit different. The top 4 companies that control beef, chicken, and pork are a little different by segment. But you've got just a handful of companies standing between all these sellers and all these buyers. So the next chart has a lot of data, but it's a scientific chart that shows what happens when you get market power like this. Okay, so you can see the tentacles snuffing out the hopes of humankind and wrapping themselves around our public institution. Obviously, I'm kidding. This is a cartoon from around 1904, I think, when they had the trust era, right? These giant corporate monopolies like Standard Oil, pictured here, the meat trust, which I mentioned earlier, that was doing exactly what the meat companies are doing today. Underpaying producers for raising things, overcharging consumers for buying things, or just giving consumers a lower quality product for the same dollar, which is basically a hidden price hike. And, critically, that arm of the octopus wrapped around Washington, which sustains and further enforces the system. And we're going to get to that in a second. This actually is a really boring chart that's hard to make sense out of, but everybody's like, oh, how could there be a monopoly? It's 2014, and gosh, look at the poor meat companies. They have really thin profit margins, just like another little company named Walmart that has thin profit margins. How could you possibly be a monopoly if you have thin profit margins? Look at these numbers. This is from the USDA. The top 4 meat packing companies. This is their operating profit margins from the years 2006 to 2010. I was trying to support a family from that whole time, as a matter of fact, but I remember 08 to 2010. Those were miserable years. People were losing jobs. People were cutting spending. People were eating less meat. What a rotten environment, right? Well, apparently it was a good enough environment for the top 4 meat packers to double their operating profit margins every year. I wish I was doubling my profit margins every year during that time. I argue this is strong evidence that we have market power. We have market power playing a critical role in the meat industry. And it's not just this one slide. This is just emblematic of the kind of market power we see. So if this kind of situation is happening across rural America, why in the world don't we have trust busters in the White House in Washington trying to restore competition and transparency to our market? Because this isn't good. Okay, this is only bad for people who raise meat and eat meat. It's good for a handful of people that run a few meat companies. So why isn't the situation being stopped? 2007, this young up-and-coming Senator, Barack Obama, is spending a lot of time in Iowa. And he's hearing these horror stories about chicken farming, hog farming. I mean, there's not enough time to go into here to talk about the abuses to farmers and the closed nature of these markets. And so what Barack Obama does is he puts himself to the left of Hillary Clinton, who's known to be a friend of Tyson Foods and Walmart. I mean, Obama gave this speech during the talk, and he gave this like rousing speech, and we're going to tell ConAgra it's a department of It's not the Department of Agribusiness, it's the Department of Agriculture. We're going to give it back to the people, so to speak, right? Well, he won Iowa, and it was because of more than this, but this really did play a role in winning over Democratic, blue-voting farmers. The fact that he was going to take on big agribusiness. And he put his money where his mouth was. I mean, in 2010, a lot of people in this room remember, that's a terrifying sight for the top lawyers at Tyson Foods and JDS. That's the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, sitting next to the Attorney General, Eric Holder, head of the Department of Justice. The two top antitrust regulators held this public hearing in Iowa. Tom Vilsack opens it up by saying, let me start off by saying how deeply concerned I am about rural America. It looked like these two agencies were going to work together hand in glove to crack down on the meat and food monopolies. I wanted to write a book about companies like Tyson Foods, and I literally thought to myself, all this stuff is going to be solved by the time a book could ever come out. Maybe I should focus on something else. Because there was this air of electricity in that room, and there were 5 workshops like this with Department of Justice, Department of Ag, going around the country, gathering hours and hours of testimony from farmers, from consumer groups. I mean, the monopolistic abuses is like all online if anybody cares to watch it. There are videos of all this stuff. There's transcripts of all this stuff. It's like evidence for a massive, massive lawsuit. So what happened? The meat industry was not excited about the idea of passing antitrust reforms. And so what they did was they started mobilizing this effort to quash the reforms. Tom Vilsack proposed some pretty stringent antitrust reforms, and the meat lobbyists, which Mr. Callicrate mentioned earlier, like the American Meat Institute, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the National Chicken Council, they spent roughly $10 million in a year lobbying members of Congress to fight these antitrust reforms. And one of my favorite stories, my slide didn't make it through on this translation here, but when Obama was visiting Iowa, the American Meat Institute took out an advertisement in a local paper saying, antitrust reforms are going to kill jobs. And it was a picture of like these farmers standing in front of a cornfield with a little baby. And apparently that was just terrifying to the Obama administration. They literally were shouting, who's responsible for this? And Tom Vilsack retreated from this effort 100%. By October 2011, Vilsack is going on TV talking about how great everything is in rural America because it's campaign season and they needed to hold up rural America as an example of prosperity. So what you saw was this effort at reform that was pulled apart by lobbyists in Washington and totally failed. And unfortunately, in some ways, it left the meat industry more powerful than if Obama had done nothing, in my opinion. So this is the happy note on which my book ends, okay? It's like The Empire Strikes Back. Everything's in disarray and horrible at the end of the book. The Empire's totally won. And it's not how I thought the book would end, but it is reality. And I do not have a chapter in the book that says, how do we solve this problem? How do we take care of this? But I have another slide that didn't make it on this. It's a photo of Hillary Clinton and Marco Rubio, and it poses the question, if this is what the Obama administration did on this topic, what is the next administration going to do? Do we seriously think that they're going to do anything about this? And my sincere opinion, having reported on this, is that we need some sort of broad public policy approach to this problem. I think your public market in Colorado Springs to sell beef and other products is commendable, healthy, and great. You're building an alternative. That's important. We also need to recognize that this alternative market is very small. While it's vigorous and healthy and entrepreneurial, it's very small. And the behemoths that produce 95% of the meat in the United States have such a firm grip over the market that the market can't really heal itself. We need a public policy approach. So I would say that anybody who cares about this needs to think about a two-pronged approach to this problem. The first being to build the alternative. And that way people can opt out of the system immediately. But the second is to somehow get Washington to the point where a politician feels like they're going to pay a higher price protecting a few corporations than they are passing some kind of reforms that would benefit farmers and people who eat meat. Because right now the equation is very clear. Yeah, I think the equation is clear that right now these people are running scared. Well, I was going to say off the record, we've got a diligent journalist here, but I'll just say I was with a group of Congress people talking about this issue, and they were literally asking me, what do we do? How do we handle this? And I'm thinking, like, Jesus, you're Congress. Why are you asking me what to do about this? But these people are literally running afraid of the tidal wave of money that these meat industry lobbies have. So that political equation has got to change if real change is going to happen. So I'll be quiet now, and I would definitely love to take your questions on this and talk about it a little more. So thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. No questions? Okay.
Questions, please.
Yeah.
When you were looking at the relationship with the contract growers and parent companies, did you ever dig into the role of the banks and the collusion between the banks?
Totally. It's so interesting. I didn't see a lot of collusion between the banks in terms of the too big to fail, like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs kind of picture. What's fascinating is that you got to wonder if a couple like Jerry and Benita go out of business, why in the world would a bank loan money on a new farm to replace them if the margins are so thin and the business is so horrible? The reason is when factory farms fail, the tab does get picked up by taxpayers. There's this obscure federal subsidy run through the Farm Service Agency that's a guaranteed loan program. And what that means is when a farm loans money on a chicken farm, and the chicken farm collapses, and the farmer defaults, taxpayers will pay 90% of the value on that loan. Taxpayers will bail out the failed loan, and the bank can then extend a new loan. Banks know that they're going to recoup that little 10% they might lose really quickly through even just like the closing fees and upfront payments. So we've got an obscure subsidy that most people don't know about that is greasing the wheels for loan after loan after loan after loan. Because I'm telling you, these banks, this is in the book, the banks know they're not on the hook when the loan fails. And most of the bank players in this are regional banks. It's not like JP Morgan, as much as I saw it. It'd be like Regions Bank in Arkansas. And they cleverly exploit this public subsidy to do that. So, my understanding is that the Farm Service Agency is a part of the Farm Credit Program. Is that what you're asking about? Or what do you mean by Farm Credit?
Farm credit services. So I think it's interesting. Farm credit administration, but there's a variety of different farm credit services across the country that work closely with USDA, but they're not government lending.
So here's all I know. I don't know the answer to your question, is my short answer. I know that the Farm Service Agency that provides these guaranteed loans and the payments on the fail is part of USDA. So somebody else here probably knows the direct answer to that question. I'm sorry. Paul?
Yes, that's the way it works. And there's a select group within this structure of financing that work with specific banks. In other words, in southeast Oklahoma, there was one bank that had 90% of the loans to those contract growers. It's a fixed deal. And I knew the appraiser that came actually from our area that worked all of those loans. So it's a set up deal that the poultry companies make sure it works. Right?
And do you know if it's in relationship with that Farm Credit Group?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So you know what? Yes, it is. This is all reporters do, is they interview smart people like Paul and regurgitate the answer. Yeah.
The phenomena in all of this that I asked this question many times and I could never get an answer. The contract grower is not an independent contractor. By law, it says certain specific things that you have to be a contract grower, to classify for that. So I thought for years that somebody would someday say, these growers are employees. And that would change the face of the earth as far as the integrators were concerned.
Yeah.
But that's one of those subjects that it just doesn't get talked about.
In your home state of Oklahoma, I think the Attorney General at one time tried to classify.
Yes.
And you are reminding me of one of my favorite stories about all this, which is back in the 60s, some contract farmers tried to get together and bargain with Tyson, and that's just like the toxic death. I mean, these companies know if that ever happened, they need to destroy it.
I know.
All right. Well, you do. And they blackballed all these farmers, and then the farmers sued them under federal antitrust statute, the Packers and Stockyards Act. And Tyson had this beautiful argument. They said the Packers and Stockyards Act governs meat packers. We're poultry dealers. You didn't mention us in the act, so therefore we do not fall under this law. And they won that. And I mean, there are not millions. There are many, many instances where they lawyer these definitions to outpace the regulatory structure, whether it's in how they pay taxes, whether they're defined as a farm or not. And this definition of calling these farmers independent producers, which is a charade and a joke, and everybody knows it, it still stands in place because they're, these are the people that help shape the legal definitions. And I do think it would change a lot for the better. It has the potential to change things a lot for the better if farmers were called employees. I mean, they might get health insurance and they would be protected against certain kinds of retaliation, which today they're not.
I had a meeting with some of the growers in out-of-the-way places too, because they were continually under surveillance when they would come to the state capitol. And it's an incredible process that some of these people went through, and yet they all lost.
Yeah.
Well, I think the group should know who you are. Senator Paul Maggie from Oklahoma has been the opposite of a friend for the poultry industry for a very, very long time. And I had the pleasure, I had the opportunity years ago, I don't remember how many years ago, Paul, a long time ago, I was asked to come and speak to the Oklahoma legislature. And I let the Packers have it. And I was on my way out, along with Mason Mungle from the Farmers Union there in Oklahoma, and I was exiting the building, and Paul Maggie came up to me and he said, I want to meet you. And it was awesome to meet this man. He had been fighting these guys for a very long time. And Paul, you saw what happened in the sheep industry. I mean, Paul's one of our board members on OCM and an original founding member of the organization, so an amazing person.
Sorry, I should have said that. I didn't want to call you out. But also, if you're interested, you can read all about Paul's exploits in the meat wreck. And I was about to get my laptop out and get some of the fiery, pithy quotes that you said on the floor of the Senate, but you're going to have to get the meat wreck.
Well, Chris, you said there's people in the room. Another person who's a champion is Bill.
Yeah.
Bill's in the room here as well.
Yeah, exactly. Dr. Heffernan is the godfather of studying this sort of corporate consolidation. I mean it. I mean, he's in the book too. He did the only longitudinal study over 40 years that tracked the conditions of chicken farmers as the industry consolidated.
And he was my inspiration.
There you go. Mine too. And he keeps laughing all these years later. I don't understand.
If he didn't, he'd cry.
Yeah. Judy, did you have a question?
I wanted to raise a comment. We've had a number of people share comments about intimidation of growers and such. And this afternoon it came up again, and we were talking about various forms of intimidation. And I just wanted to mention to this group, because I'm not sure many of you quite realize this, but the amount of intimidation that goes on in the academy, in other words, ag school, schools around the country is phenomenal. Some years ago, at the World Sociological Society national meetings, we had an entire panel of people that were researchers, just world sociology researchers. I mean, we're considered sort of harmless type people. You know, we're not those big biotech people that are discovering that the atrazine in the water is unhealthy for your children to drink, you know. And we had a whole array of people that told their stories about pressure from the dean's office on up and down the line. Failure to get tenure, people, you know, it is unbelievable. And one of the comments I was going to make this afternoon while we were raising heck with a lot of people, it might be worthwhile for some of you groups, particularly that are working on local food, to get yourselves together and go visit the dean up at Colorado State and say, what are you doing for us? You know, we're paying your salaries. Was it Barry last night said, when we lobby, we're kind of pitiful creatures, demand things from. Now, I don't know that you'll be warmly received. I'm thinking you won't, but let me tell you, they won't be able to ignore you. But the faculty need support, and we have people at the University of Missouri that are now retired, and that's when they become dangerous, because now they can say things. We have people that have been working on Monsanto products, and have been kept quiet. Now they're getting ready to talk.
Wow.
I mean, it's that kind of intimidation level that's enormous, particularly when you have a Monsanto building on your campus. Or that first hearing in Ankeny, Iowa, was held in the Monsanto auditorium. You remember that?
Yeah. Joe, you seem to, Mr. Maxwell.
Chris, on intimidation, I was, Mike, you told this story earlier today. Mike came from Missouri. I was in Missouri City at that time. Trying to pass legislation that created a state cool packer ban on livestock and gave the state attorney general authority to enforce gypsum.
In Cool's Country Board of Labor.
Yeah, Cool's Country Board of Labeling. And Jim Matheson was the president pro tem of the Missouri Senate. I was a state senator from Northeast Missouri. And Jim, today in Missouri, is now the home of Mr. Tyson in Missouri. And they needed to change one word in Missouri statute that I was dealing with. They needed to change the word "in" to "or," and then Tyson would be a family farm in Missouri, Family Farm Corporation. And I said no. So in comes a guy named Archibald, I don't remember his name, Archibald III.
Oh, yeah, Archie Schaefer.
Yeah.
I'm familiar, yeah.
He comes into my office, the governor's person's there, the pro tem is there, and Archibald asked me, he said, well, we need you to change this, you know, we're going to bring this great economic development to Missouri and promise you so many, how much ever production in my district. I said, no, I really don't need that. I said, I think it has to fill it out here. A week later, he comes back in, and governor's staff person's there, the governor's there, and Mel Carnahan, and Jim Matheson, and myself. And this guy asked me, he said, well, now, Joe, he said, your uncles, they raise chickens for us down in Arkansas. My mom's from Arkansas. I said, yeah. He said, well, now, what's their name? What town do they live in? And I said, sir, you can go piss up a rope, get out of my office, don't ever come back. Governor's eyes are about this big. Governor's staff's eyes are about this big. Governor's staff, after everybody left my office, came back and said, you can't tell a billionaire to go piss up a rope. I said, yes, I can. But that is the intimidation that they have. And if I would have told them, they'd be out of business. My uncle's trying to retire now. He has about $1.5 million borrowed for Tyson. Kids that not want to raise chickens.
Wow.
And he's probably going to, you know, one day he just has to walk away.
That's really a revolting story. And it really is. I mean, that really makes me sick. Because I've never met someone more stressed out than a chicken farmer. I mean, it's a very horrible, at times, way to make a living. And Judy, I believe everything you're saying about that intimidation, just sort of looking at the final product of research at a lot of the land-grant universities. I remember, saying, oh, it's time in the book now. I got to find a study to talk about the economic effects of vertical integration versus diffuse ownership of businesses. I mean, there's nothing out there. I can find a million studies about how to reduce abscesses in the foot of a cow and cattle feedlot. But, you know, studying these broader implications, geez, Bill Heffernan had to like give me a copy of his study from 40 years ago, like it was like underground literature or something. A printed out copy of it. So I believe that completely. Yeah.
Just one more comment. I did the interviewing sort of headed up the interviewing in the 81 study. Bill had to go back and make hay and do that. Probably a bit visiting faculty at school. In fact, it's 3 out, that's true. We had been visiting faculty at LSU that semester. And so I was in North Louisiana doing this. And I did some of the interviewing. We had other paid interviewers. And I thought, man, these Louisiana men are such chivalrous people, you know. They were opening the door for me and they were walking me to the pickup that I was driving to do the interviewing. And then I discovered it didn't take very long that the intimidation factor was so great. They did not want to answer some of my questions in front of their wives. And so I literally had men say to me, well, looking over their shoulder, I didn't want to say this in front of my wife, but they just told me we're supposed to upgrade the buildings or get out of business.
Yeah.
I mean, it's that intimidating with families.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Well, Chris, let me just tell you, too, how long this lasts. I passed the legislation in 19 for hogs and chicken and dog, and it was pretty much environmental Senate legislation. 2 years ago, over a course of 12 months, 18 months, I made 4 announced appearances on the Oklahoma State University campus. And by the way, it's not the School of Agriculture, because they banned me from speaking any agriculture. 3 of these events, there was a Tyson minder there.
Oh, yeah.
And
Wow.
one of them I knew personally. And I called him out. And I said, my God, here we are, 15 years out. And you're still concerned about somebody like me. And I couldn't believe the extent that these people go to keep track of my calipharies of all me. But they didn't.
It's amazing. Steve, do you have this guy, Steve Tittner's a great ag writer, blogger. I think you pretty much probably disagree with most of what I say, probably. I mean, I'd love to hear, do you have a question, or, this probably sounds, you think it's nonsense?
The only, and I don't pretend to be, I don't know nearly as much about the poultry business as I do the beef business, but I asked you earlier, and you might want to address it for the group, and that is, if most of the contract poultry producers have the kind of experience that you talk about in the book, how on earth does Tyson keep enough supply to stay in business at however many a million birds a week it takes?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think you also kind of pointed out that...
Could you repeat the question?
Well, the question is, if life is so bad for chicken farmers, if this is such a dire situation, how in the world can Tyson stay in business, or the companies like Tyson, like Pilgrims, and have a steady supply of chickens and farmers working for them? I mean, we could go get chicken anywhere in this town tonight. There is no shortage. And furthermore, I mean, I think you also pointed out that sometimes the squeaky wheel talks the loudest, and it's folks who are put out of business through bad practices or bad luck that want to complain. They're going to be the first ones to search out a journalist. So, maybe we're getting kind of a skewed picture here of reality. And, I'll take those one at a time. I think Tyson can get a steady supply of birds in large part, and I've thought about this a lot, because of the lack of opportunity in rural America. I mean, we've seen the number of jobs in agriculture diminish tremendously over the recent decades. Manufacturing was once a pillar of the rural economy, and that has also been gutted. And a lot of the people in the towns with the Tyson Foods plant, and Tyson is emblematic, I don't mean to just pick on them, but they have really limited options. And I think they see poultry farming as one of the best options available to them. And I do think there's an element of wishful thinking that I'm going to make it work, and that these brochures I'm being given must be true. And I bet those folks are squeaky wheels and I can make this work. I think that there's a human element in this. And I think that's why you have a lot of people getting into this business. And I think the folks that are in it are in too far over their heads to just walk away. And they're also hardworking people that don't want to just quit and cancel their contract if they could. So I think it is a case of poultry companies choosing to move into areas that are economically marginal and then keeping those areas economically marginal. And then in terms of whether or not it's just people complaining, I sincerely believe that actually the industry is structured against the interests of chicken farmers. That this is a systemic and structural issue we're talking about here, not just a few folks who had a bad experience or went out of business, you know. And I'm probably not going to change your mind with that, but it is sincerely what I believe. And, you know, I didn't just invent the book. It came from trying to understand what was going on and interviewing a lot of people and seeing a lot of scenarios like this. That's where it came from.
Chris, I might add a bit to that. There's a willingness in this country to stand on the neck of your neighbor for $1. Doesn't bother some people to take advantage of their neighbor and to maximize their profits to themselves. And what I was really, really shocked by and disturbed by, Chris, is at your news conference symposium in D.C. there at the New America Foundation, is that poultry farmer they drug in there to promote contract poultry farming, to tell everybody how wonderful it was and loved the tournament system because he thought competition was cool. And celebrated as his neighbors went out of business and he was paid the premiums. And more of a premium because he was coming to Washington that day to say Chris Leonard was wrong in his book. Don.
Yes, in Webster County, Kentucky, which has the largest number of poultry houses in the state of Kentucky. Hudson built a plant there in 1996. Tyson bought it in 1998. In 2012, 3/4 of the poultry growers that started with Tyson in 1998 had turned over. And so folks are moving out relatively quickly. The people that have moved in to take over those houses have been largely Mennonites who have large numbers of children, who have a lot of what amounts to free labor, and so they can make a profit as opposed to growers who can't. But many of those Mennonites are now getting out of Tyson as well. So it doesn't take, I mean, there is people get in, for example, growers there, the primary financiers of poultry houses in that part of the world was MetLife. And so they were offering $1 million loans on $1,000 down. So you can get in quickly, then you get into a lot of debt, and then you're in big trouble.
Boy, I really want to tell a story in response to that. Mennonites are what I would call sort of an alternative economic model in terms of the free labor and sort of communal help on the farm. It's very different from your typical middle-class farmer where a couple owns the farm and does all the work. In Waldron, where I was, we saw a similar revolution as in the turning of the wheel, where local farmers were getting out, and we saw Laotians moving in, who had an economic structure similar to Mennonites, where neighbors would help neighbors. There was a lot of, these folks did not mind sleeping on a mattress on the floor and having a wood-burning stove, and they could kind of help that helped make the economics of this business work, but they also were ground under the wheel of the tournament system. And these people who come into it do well for a little while, and then they don't do well, because that's how the tournament is structured, is to constantly push downward on your earnings until you are just earning nothing or you get out of the business. And I'll never forget interviewing a couple who were in the book that borrowed $2 million, a Hmong couple. They borrowed $2 million, Nook and Nui, to build a new Tyson Foods complex. And I went down the farm and I was talking to Jerry Andel, who was living in a trailer, sitting out on the front porch talking to me, smoking a cigarette. And I told him about Nook and Nui Yang, and he just took a long drag off his cigarette and said, they're doomed. And he was right, you know. I mean, they were pushed into exactly the kind of situation he was. So it's a turning revolution, and I guess to put it without coloring it, I guess I would say it's a reprehensible racket that is slanted against people who raise food.
Kind of a nice segue. I was going to say, in kind of a larger picture, it's a discussion about risk and about solidarity. And the meta model is that the worker or the entrepreneur, whoever it is, a small guy or gal, essentially all the risk is being dumped on them. And it's like a bad B thriller movie where you finally get to the end of the movie and you kill the alien and you think, oh my God, I'm going to make it to the other side. And then the alien's baby hatches just before the movie goes out. And that's where you end up at the yard dealing with 2 or 4 bidders, fake bidders. And then you go to the sequel, and it's like every time there's a crop rotation or another herd going in, it's just another horror movie you can't get out of. I mean, so the risk issues, every worker faces the same kind of problem with no insurance, health insurance, no rights, no nothing, because they all got stripped away in the big mega play. And then why do they let it happen? Because there's no solidarity. And so the issues are kind of very much related.
I agree with that completely. I do. And the folks running these companies are not stupid. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're arranging the system to shift risk on the farm level and shift bad assets onto the farm level too. I mean, they're designing the system that way.
Chris, I might mention, the head buyer for IBP was Bruce Bass. Bruce Bass was a really slick guy. I mean, he presented himself well, he was well spoken. His major was not animal science or meat science. His major was psychology.
Why would we?
This guy was good at mentally conditioning you to give your cattle to him at below your cost. Wow, was he amazing. And he made IBP a lot of money. He made that company grow exponentially over the years. The other thing, in answer to Steve's comment about how they keep them coming, the suckers, P.T. Barnum sort of effect. For those of you who have read The Jungle of 1906, Juris, remember Juris in The Jungle? He was the big, tough, was he a Lithuanian?
Yeah.
He was the big, tough guy. Hey, Don, you're just a wuss. I know you're broken down and you're not tough enough to do the deal, but I'm tough. I'm young and I can do this. And you know what, at the end of the book? He was broken down. So we have that mentality going on in this as well. So I can work harder, I can work longer. It'll work for me even though it may not have worked for you. Yes, Reed.
Doesn't Mr. Dittmer's question imply that we're obligated to keep Tyson in business with chickens?
Absolutely not.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think we are either, but I thought that kind of the basis for the question was, how is Tyson ever going to do this?
No, I didn't read that into your question at all. I think he was challenging the premise and saying it strikes you as unfeasible that if a business was this bad, there'd be enough farmers in business to keep delivering chickens to Tyson. And I guess what I'm saying is that there's this sort of equilibrium that's reached where there are enough suffering farmers putting up with this to provide chickens, and then there are enough people willing to get into it for lack of better options and enough subsidized loans to keep them in business. That's really what I think. I mean, that is how it is out there.
It's dynamic, it's not static, so then there's always another way to fix this system and rig it. And these guys are going to be looking at all the capital borrowing opportunities and risk shedding opportunities 10 years in the future and figuring out how to make sure they find a sucker to plug into that stuff.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, the first story I wrote about Laotian chicken farmers in Waldron, Arkansas, I'm not kidding. I literally thought, man, I might get into chicken farming. Because it was these young people, they were optimistic, entrepreneurial, they wanted to work hard, and it just seemed awesome. You know, they could be their own bosses. And 5 years later, they were in the exact position as their predecessors. They were declaring bankruptcy, they were just dropping and leaving, they were stressed out, they had no control over their destiny. So, you know, you can see how there's this human element of every new person who gets in thinks it's going to work for them.
You know, I just had a thought, Don Stoll. You weren't in the bookstore today.
I'm sorry?
You were not in the bookstore today at the event.
blame-
Aaron, we goofed.
I know, Slaughterhouse Blues started.
Don Stoll is a professor from Kansas University, University of Kansas, that wrote the book Slaughterhouse Blues. And it's an amazing book. It talks about the workers in the slaughterhouses.
Yeah.
And Don is a longtime board member of the Organization for Competitive Markets. So, yes, Aaron.
So we'll make it available to Ranch Food Track.
Yeah.
So all the time.
So, yeah, we got some good folks in the room that know what's going on.
You mean we don't have to go to Amazon?
Any other questions? Chris.
All right, well, I'll be around if you have any other questions for sure, and thanks for the time.